Well, welcome to the Danube Institute Budapest. This is our latest video podcast. My name is Mark Higgie, Senior Fellow at the Institute, and it's my great privilege and pleasure today to be able to speak to the distinguished journalist Miranda Devine. Miranda is practically a household name in Australia, where she made her reputation. But for the past year has been based in New York at the New York Post, where many will be aware of her close involvement with the sensational scoops that have come out over the past couple of weeks. So what we're going to do today, with Miranda's help, is discuss discuss the latest on all of that. And then talk a bit more generally about the prospects for the election 1 week today. So again, welcome, Miranda, and great to have you.
Thanks, Mark. Lovely to talk to you and all your viewers wherever they are.
Well, we've got a few of them. People would be surprised. But well, if I could start with and as I say, congratulations to you on the astonishing story which has come out. So perhaps if I could ask you first about the Great Bombshell. There's a lot of detail in it, but what aspects of it would you regard as potentially the most embarrassing to Joe Biden and potentially with the most capacity to have an impact on the election?
Well, look, I don't think it's going to have too much of an impact on the election, simply because 60 million people have already voted early, and because say it's fairly complicated. But I think the worst aspect of this is a story that has been floating around for years. Everybody's known that there's been something fishy about Joe Biden's family's involvement in businesses overseas, and Hunter Biden is the most obvious of those family members, but it's also James Biden and Frank Biden and Sarah Biden, who are Joe's brothers and sister-in-law. They've all been involved in this family business, which appears to be all about monetizing Joe's influence, particularly when he was vice president, but also as a future presidential candidate. And so the problem is that nobody has really been able to nail him. He's always denied having had anything to do with Hunter Biden, his wayward 49-year-old drug addict son's businesses overseas. His son, he flew around the world on Air Force Two when he was vice president. On one famous occasion in 2013, he took him to China on an 8-day visit, and Joe was supposed to go there, and he had a laundry list of items that he was supposed to ask President Xi for on America's behalf. Like, for instance, something very important to Australia is demilitarize, or to stop militarizing those islands in the South China Sea, and also to stop ripping off American intellectual property from American companies. So he had some really big ticket items. And after 8 days, Joe Biden walked away empty-handed, but Hunter Biden, his son, who had come along for the ride, walked away with a $1.5 billion deal with a subsidiary of the Bank of China. And so that always looked unethical, but Joe Biden always insisted, no, I don't know anything about Hunter's business dealings, and we never discuss it. And so I think what the so-called laptop from hell that the New York Post discovered, that Rudy Giuliani gave us, I think what that did was it opened this Pandora's box of evidence that's still tumbling out, that Joe Biden not only knew about his family's shady dealings with shady companies in the Ukraine, in China, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, like all over the world. Not only was he aware of it, but he was actually benefiting from it. And one of the most, I'll just give you one example because, as you say, it's complicated, but the first and probably best example that we published on page 1 2 weeks ago was this email from a sort of Hunter Biden's boss, I guess, at the corrupt energy company Burisma in Ukraine. Hunter was organising a meeting between this guy, who was number 3 in Burisma, and his father, who was then vice president in Washington. And this is a meeting that Joe's office then said, "Oh no, that doesn't appear on his official calendar," and then later walked back and said, "Well, there might have been a meeting, but it would have been a ancillary, informal."
Yeah.
And then there's other, there's another very damning. I think it's an email or a text message or a WhatsApp message. There's so much that is a sort of a memo of the way that a particular Chinese deal is going to be divvied up between 6 people, and that's Hunter Biden's partners and Hunter Biden and his uncle Jim Biden. But Hunter also keeps, Hunter gets 20% of this deal, but he also keeps another 10% for the big guy. And one of Hunter Biden's partners has since come out and given a press conference and handed over 3 phones full of messages and emails and voice calls and so on to the FBI. And he says that the big guy was Joe Biden, and he was well known, and that Hunter Biden would refer to his father as the chairman and defer to him whenever he was doing deals. He'd always have to get sign off from him. So that's the embarrassing part. Joe Biden, at the very least, has been proven to be a liar.
Yes, absolutely. And what though would you say to the taking the sort of devil's advocate position here to? I think Greg Sheridan's run this line that one of the things that paradoxically is helping Biden at the moment is that you have the background of Russiagate and all of that complexity and all those claims a while ago, and that it's possible that a number of voters might just be a little bit sick of exotic foreign conspiracy theories. And of course, in addition to that, you've got all the denials from the Democrats and the media ignoring it or spinning it. Do you think those are sort of might be possible countervailing factors against all this sensational stuff, or not?
Yes, I suppose they could be. The response of the Democrats, as it is to practically everything, is to call it Russian disinformation. Where there's just zero evidence of that, and the intelligence agencies have come out and said there's nothing. FBI has come out and said there's no evidence of that. It's just implausible in every way. But I think that really, contrary to what Greg Sheridan's saying and your devil's advocate position, there was a poll that Rasmussen put out yesterday showing that a majority of Americans were aware of this story. Despite the censorship from Facebook and Twitter and the sort of media silence, they were aware of it, and that they believed that that Joe Biden was aware of his son's questionable business deals, but also may have benefited from them. And among Republicans, the numbers, I can't remember the exact numbers, I think it was 54% overall, but among Republicans, the numbers were high, and Democrats, they were low. Democrats, I think, were down around the 30% mark. They just put their fingers in their ears and decided that didn't want to hear about it. And interestingly, black voters, it was 63% believe this. I asked the pollster about that, Rasmussen's managing editor, and he said, look, the numbers, the sample size with black voters is so small that the margin of error would be huge, so don't put too much stock in that number. But anyway, the fact is that voters are aware, and I think partly that is because it's not just a dry sort of Russia story. There's a lot of sex involved because on the laptop from hell, Hunter Biden, it's unbelievable how many, there's sort of selfie videos, sex selfie videos, and, videos of his private parts, just nonstop, and smoking crack and, cavorting with hookers. And he just seemed that really seems to be what filled his days, and perhaps still does. And he filmed himself doing all these things. And so while the New York Post never published any of that, we did publish one sort of grainy photograph showing Hunter Biden asleep with a crack pipe in his mouth. And we did that just to show that really it's implausible to think that someone like this, with no language skills in Ukraine, no experience or understanding of the energy sector, would be paid over $80,000 a month by Burisma for his expertise on the board, when he also was just a chronic drug abuser. And but since then, some Chinese outfit, an independent sort of democracy pushing Chinese outfit based, I think, in Taiwan, has got hold of all the contents, and they've spilled them onto the internet, all the sex tapes, all the crack, the whole thing. So, but I think that salacious element of it, which we alluded to, which Rudy Giuliani talks about, there's also some rather unsavory parts which I think have been exaggerated, talking about, how I say it nicely, some untoward behaviour towards a minor, young girl, which I think that's been exaggerated. But anyway, all of that adds to that sort of air of, it makes people's ears prick up and they want to know more. So maybe that's why it's travelled so quickly. And the other reason, I think, is because Facebook and Twitter, immediately that we started 2 weeks ago, that we tweeted and started spreading our story as usual on their platforms, just closed us down, just censored us. The New York Post Twitter account is still locked 13 days later. And so I think that even though the rest of the media was ignoring the actual story, the story of the censorship was so historic and just bizarre that then became a story of its own. And I think, like in all these cases, the censorship had the opposite effect. It's the so-called Streisand effect. I remember when Barbara Streisand put out the word that she didn't like people coming and taking photographs of her beach house at Malibu. And of course, that just made more people take more photos. Yes. So I think the same effect has happened here.
So there's clear signs, you would say, that the story is cutting through, and certainly in terms of awareness. Is it your sense that this is shifting votes?
I don't think so, partly because it happened so late in the cycle, in this year's cycle, where so many people have already voted. I've talked to a couple of pollsters about this. They say, in a normal year, in a normal election year, it probably would have had more effect. And, there's some stories at the moment saying that, like I said, 60 million people have already voted, but there's some evidence that people, after the Hunter Biden story came out, were Googling madly to see, how can I change my vote?
Yes.
So
that's right.
And I think the way it's lethal to Joe Biden is that he's running on really nothing but being not Donald Trump, being the sort of the decent guy, the honourable, honest guy. He talks about himself like that, honest Joe, lunch pail Joe, and this just punctures that image, because it makes him, at best, just like any other rotten politician, whose influence peddling or people around him are, and at worst, something much worse, very corrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we expect more details over the next week?
Oh, yes. Look, tonight, Tucker Carlson, who has, on Fox News, the most watched cable news show ever in the world. I mean, he's getting bigger ratings than anybody ever has in America. He's interviewing for the whole hour Tony Bobulinski, who's the former Hunter Biden partner, who, is a very believable, credible person. He's a former Navy lieutenant. He's was a businessman with proper bona fides before he got embroiled through a college friend in this business. And you can see from the emails he's already released and the WhatsApp messages, and also from what we saw on Hunter's laptop, you can see that he was the one trying to put some sort of proper corporate governance into these businesses that they were opening up, and complaining that Hunter Biden was, behaving in a non-orthodox way, let's say, and also was contributing nothing. And then Hunter Biden gets very angry in a few of these messages and tells him, I'm everything to do with this business. These Chinese partners wouldn't be doing business with us if it wasn't for my family name. That's our asset. That's all we've got. So he's talking to the FBI. He's talking to the Senate Homeland Affairs, Homeland Security Committee. So I think he's probably very interesting. There's another former partner called Bevan Cooney, who's currently in jail over another deal gone wrong that Hunter managed to evade any culpability for. But he's also starting to spill the beans. He's given Peter Schweitzer, who's a sort of investigative reporter and author here, access to all his emails. So that's 20 or 30,000 emails that Peter Schweitzer's gone through, and he's been running some really comprehensive stories, sort of pulling together Bobulinski, Bevan Cooney, Hunter's laptop, and Ron Johnson, who's a Republican senator who's the chair of the Homeland Security Committee. They did a huge report, I think 700-page report that was released to complete silence, apart from a few reporters. And it just goes into the Biden family influence peddling business, I guess you could call it. And they discovered a whole lot of things, such as that Hunter Biden was wired $3.5 million from the widow of the mayor of Moscow, who was a crony of Vladimir Putin. So, you add all these things together and it becomes a pretty compelling story. So I think it'll go on and on and on. I not before the election, but I think after the election, probably the FBI will have to step in.
Yeah. Well, with all of that playing out, including this interview you mentioned on Fox tonight, it seems all the more extraordinary that the mainstream media, if they continue to try and smother it, I mean, it will just seem more and more strange. I suppose by the weekend, even, but which I suppose leads us to the next sort of part of this whole saga, which is the media's reaction to it. I mean, do you think it would be an exaggeration to say that Donald Trump in this election has been fighting not only the Democrats but the media?
You're spot on, 100%. He is. I mean, I think that in fact the media is probably more formidable a foe than the Democrats, who've been running an appalling campaign. It's a party, in the middle of a civil war between the sort of ancient, establishment and the left-wing upstarts like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and of course their spiritual leader is Bernie Sanders. So that's why they have such a subpar candidate in Joe Biden, the sort of compromise candidate that the establishment imposed. So really, without the media running cover for Joe Biden in every single way, to the point where they'll have a town hall and the very night that we published this bombshell story on page 1 about Hunter Biden's laptop, Joe Biden did a town hall in front of a live audience with George Stephanopoulos from ABC News, and he wasn't asked a single question about this. He's asked, and then a few days later, he immediately went into his basement and basically laid low. I mean, pretty much since we ran the story, he's barely emerged from the basement. I think he's come out 4 or 5 times for very short trips and really not made himself available for media questions. But at one point, he went with one of Hunter's daughters, his granddaughter, as a sort of a human shield, to get an ice cream I think it was in Delaware or somewhere, and the sort of media pool that follows him everywhere shouted questions at him, and really the main question was, what flavour is your ice cream? So he just gets away with blue murder, whereas Donald Trump is pilloried. I mean, the hostility that comes at him from the Washington press pool is and the insolence, really, very, very rude questions and kind of pointless questions which don't get any information for the public, but just are there to needle the president and so on. He is his own worst enemy, though. I mean, I don't think it's served him well to have set up this hostile relationship with the media. It just belittles him, makes him look petty and bad-tempered, and he's really the most transparent president that we've seen, I don't know, ever. He just makes himself available every single day. When he's walking from one place to the other, and he's had questions shouted at him, he always answers them. Too much, he gives out too much information, I guess, for his own good. It's fantastic when you're a journalist, but I think that familiarity breeds contempt from his point of view. But I'm just shocked at how partisan the formerly august publications that really lead the way for the rest of the media and the sort of narrative that they follow, and that's the New York Times and the Washington Post, and then the broadcasters. I mean, whether it's CNN or CBS or ABC, they pretty much just give Joe Biden a free pass, and they also police each other. When somebody shouted a question at Joe Biden about the laptop, I think he was from CBS. Not just Joe Biden, spat back at him and angrily, but his colleagues laughed at him.
And as the story continues to gather momentum, you don't see any sign of sort of cracks in the mainstream media solidarity to not allow this to become a big story. Do you think basically the smothering, the word you've used, will continue over the next week without any sort of defections?
I think so, because if the Tony Bobulinski press conference wasn't enough to convince everyone else that this was a story, I don't know what would be. And Fox News was the only big media organisation that carried that press conference live, and I suppose it makes sense that a lot of Democrats don't believe that Joe Biden has done anything wrong because they don't know about it, because America's now so divided and people's media choices are so fractured that people are in their own narrow channel of information, and they just hear and read what they want to find out about. And that's why I think they're so shocked and so sort of angered and upset when they meet somebody with a different viewpoint, because they've been so cosseted. This is both sides. Actually, probably more the left, because the right has the other side forced down their throat because it's everywhere. I mean, most of the media is like that. But if you're of the left and you just consume, the sort of establishment news sources like the New York Times, you would be shocked to find that your idea of reality actually isn't shared by everybody. And you might think that people who don't share your idea of reality are morons or evil. And that's in fact what's happening. I mean, the vitriol and violence against Trump supporters, including some being murdered, has been something to really, it's terrifying. And also what it's done is it's made Trump voters pull their heads in and hide their voting intentions. I think the pollsters are telling me that the shy Trump voter phenomenon is enormous and making it very difficult for pollsters to really get it right, because Republican voters are 10 to 15 points more likely to hide their voting intentions than Democrat voters, who are very proud about voting for Joe Biden and against Donald Trump because that's fashionable. But also a new phenomenon, which is sort of malicious Trump voters who, if they do deign to talk to a pollster, it's only to mislead them and pretend that, yes, they are voting for Joe Biden or something, that they're not voting for Donald Trump. So that may be skewing the polls. And the other problem with, I think, the polls, the inaccuracy of the polls, is that because they're wildly, some of them are ridiculous. Texas, for instance, which is, has historically has always been a Trump plus 10 state. A lot of the polls are showing it up 5 points for Biden, which just doesn't pass the sniff test. So I think part of the problem is because of COVID, that, the polls more than ever are now just phone and internet, and that's just very unreliable. And they're not doing, face-to-face interviews, which probably would garner maybe more accurate responses.
Yeah. Just to finish on the media, of course, we haven't mentioned the social media aspect of it all, and I think you mentioned before that this was an own goal that has encouraged people to be more curious about the story. But nevertheless, it's what Twitter has done is just astonishing, and I suppose what it leaves us with is that that these big tech outfits have really outed themselves as political players. You'd agree with that?
Oh, very much so. I don't know if you remember, but after the 2016 election, there was a leaked video recording of some Google meeting of executives in which they were all, beating their chests and wailing and carrying on about the fact that Trump had won and that they'd let down the country because they hadn't stopped it, and that they'd make sure that didn't happen next time. And they have all sorts of ways, whether it's Google or Facebook or Twitter, to, secretly manipulate the information people see. And that's all been well documented. But I think that the sort of censoring of the New York Post story has been such an egregious and obvious example that it's really going to backfire badly on the social media giants if the Republicans, senators, are true to their word. Part of the problem in Washington is that both sides of politics are compromised. The lobbyists, their lavish favors on both sides, and so let's see if their bite is worse than their bark. But what they're saying at the moment is that they want to haul Jack Dorsey in, the CEO of Twitter, and subpoena him and grill him, although they've done that before to no effect to all the social media bosses. But also, they're talking about this Section 230, which is basically an immunity that these platforms have, which other publishers don't. We as a newspaper are subject to laws of defamation and contempt and so on, and Facebook and Google and Twitter are not. And so that's because they're supposed to be impartial platforms, just like the pipes that your electricity goes down. But now that they're acting as publishers, they should use that immunity, goes the argument. But probably more serious than that is the use of antitrust laws to break them up. You know, they're too big, they're too powerful, so you break them up, just as the railroads were, many moons ago.
It's tempting to reflect more generally on where journalism in Western countries is going, I suppose. Chris Mitchell had a very interesting article in The Australian, I thought, where he quoted a professor at Stanford University, Ted Glasser, as saying that journalists today have to abandon objectivity and become promoters of social justice. I mean, and it would seem that open political agenda. I mean, obviously, there's always been an element of that, but is it your sense that this is becoming a more extreme phenomenon and that much more obvious, and journalists not valuing the old-fashioned things of objectivity and balance?
Oh yes, I mean quite the opposite. It's as that Professor Glasser said. What hope is there for young journalists if that's what they're being taught at college?
Absolutely.
And taught that objectivity and impartiality, which is showing both sides, which is what the best journalism is supposed to be, is actually wrong. That's not what you should be doing. That if you don't use your power as a journalist to shape the world in the way you want it, then somehow you're not doing your job properly. And the tragedy is that I think the advent of Trump has really accelerated that, because during the 2016 election, the New York Times quite proudly said, well, Trump is such a clear and present danger to our republic that we have to jettison all of our ideals and use all our resources to stop him. And of course, that didn't work. And the media is even worse. I mean, they've spent 4 years relentlessly going after him, printing completely unverified stories from anonymous sources, which turned out to be lies, and a deliberate misinformation campaign started by the Democrats, and pretending to be a Russian disinformation campaign. And the Democrats, Obama and Clinton and Joe Biden, weaponized the intelligence agencies against Donald Trump, and all of that was swallowed and amplified by the New York Times and all these other media outfits who won Pulitzer Prize for them and haven't given them back, even though all those stories have been proven to be lies. So I don't really know where you go with that, except that the media has, thrown away its credibility, which is really all it has. And for what? Because they've been unsuccessful spectacularly. And in fact, I would argue that the more Trump is attacked, the better it is for him electorally, because who would have thought that after 4 years in office, he's running again in 2020 as an outsider? And, on my travels through Trump country, I mean, through the Rust Belt, formerly, places like Pennsylvania, which, once a very Democrat state, is now flipped to be slightly Republican only because of Trump. These are former Democrat voters who believe that he speaks for them. They see the establishment attacks on him, particularly by the media, as making him a fellow traveller, because they're attacked and maligned and described as deplorables and laughed at and scorned, just as Donald Trump is. So it works for him really well, and he just manages to turn the tables on what he calls the fake news media. He's losing skin as well, but in a strange way. I think that the media, despite themselves, are going to help him win again.
So we've spoken about the opinion polls, and you've explained why we should be very sceptical on a number of fronts. That was interesting what you said about the 10 to 15% of Republicans not being prepared to be frank about their voting intention, and Texas. What's your? Are you going to share with us whether you're laying any bets on the outcome?
Yes. I talked to pollsters quite a lot. One I've been talking to is Rasmussen, which was one of the three tracking polls that was the most accurate in 2016, and they poll every single day. And so from the trajectory, you can see, more than just the daily numbers. But they have had Trump down behind Biden as much as 12 points in the last month. Yesterday he was up 1 point, margin of error 2.5%. So you can't read much into it, but the momentum is what you're looking at a week out from the election. And then I speak to other pollsters, one who is a private pollster for hedge funds based in Florida, and he was scarily accurate in 2016. And he says it's all about the economy. He's only interested in the battleground states because Trump's not going to win the popular vote. And Rasmussen says that the numbers and the trajectory of the numbers and the tightening of the race so that the two candidates are neck and neck is identical to what happened in 2016. And Albert, this private pollster, says the same thing. He says that Trump will win the Electoral College, that the battleground states that he's looking at, Florida, no problem, Pennsylvania, he'll probably win, particularly after he made that terrible gaffe last week during the debate he was just honest, accidentally honest, where he admitted that he was going to shut down the oil industry, or he said transition out of the oil industry. Donald Trump calls it killing the oil industry. And that adds to previous many comments on the campaign trail during the primary season when he said he was going to end fracking, end fossil fuels. And this is all about the Green New Deal and this very radical left-wing, the most radical policy that any presidential candidate's ever brought to the American people. And that's because this civil war between the left and the right of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden had to sign on with Bernie Sanders' manifesto. So the Green New Deal is, just basically is going to make America carbon neutral by 2050. And that's, considering America last year became energy independent, it has all this cheap, abundant energy, this oil and gas, and fracking is just such a boom industry, creating so many jobs in places like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, and all those jobs, those areas which are ground zero of the deindustrialization of America, where the opioid crisis was out of control, they're coming good. And when you talk to the people out there, as I said, formerly Democrats, they are rusted on Trump voters. They just love him. He's one of them. But, I mean, it's mainly hip pocket, and you could say the same for, it's different reasons, but in, say, Wisconsin and Minnesota, or not Minnesota, probably he won't win, but Wisconsin and Michigan, and there's another one up there. There's the corn farmers are making a fortune because their corn is being turned into ethanol. So when Biden says, "Well, I'm going to kill off the oil industry," that affects them and the rural communities that rely on them. They're booming, and Trump has been very clever in sort of narrow casting policies, which has gone under the radar with most of the media, but policies which benefit those farmers in those states, because he knows that will win him the state, because that's the prosperity. So it all comes down to the economy. And even though in the regular polls Trump doesn't do very well on many metrics on the economy, there was a poll just a couple of weeks ago, Wall Street Journal NBC poll, which showed Trump ahead 48-41 to Biden. And also an extraordinary poll. I think it was a Gallup poll a little while ago, asking people, do you feel better off today than you did 4 years ago? And in 2020, the number was yes from 56% of voters, which is a lot higher than any other election year for the last, I think, 6 election cycles. So, there are a lot of pinpoints of light for the Trump camp. And then the other major, everything that's not mainstream polling, every metric points towards Trump doing well. And one of those, which I'm told is very significant, is voter registration. And so the Republicans have very cleverly looked at the map in 2016, seen where they did well, and then gone to those states like Pennsylvania and, increased their buffer. So gone and done, knocked on doors, got lots of voters registered, and done those face-to-face contacts at a time when, the Biden campaign has sort of decided to be hyper paranoid about the pandemic and just run a virtual campaign. And you see now that the Trump people have done more door knocks than the Obama people, which is extraordinary. And at a time when people are craving contact, I mean, we're social animals and everybody's locked inside, and really to have a pleasant, canvasser come and knock on your door and talk to you from behind a mask, maybe, people like that. And those, you can't underestimate the power of those one-on-one contacts. And you also, when you're in New York and, part of the media headquarters, in New York, everyone wears masks. The coronavirus hit very hard here. 40,000 people died. It was a catastrophe. But in much of the rest of the country, it really wasn't. And they feel, and Republicans also, it's a big difference between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are much more paranoid about the virus than Republicans. And so if you travel out to Wheeling, West Virginia, or Steubenville, Ohio, or parts of Pennsylvania, people just aren't wearing masks, and they're just living life fairly normally.
Yeah, you mentioned the economy as the big issue. What about law and order? I would have thought that given the leftist anarchy that's been such a big feature of the US for much of the year, you'd think that law and order and Trump's ability to distance to associate a lot of that anarchy with the Democrats would be a winner for him. Is that being given much emphasis, that issue?
Yes, it was. I mean, it was a huge drumbeat, even probably up till about a month ago. But Trump, because he's always been associated with police and law and order, and is like the tough guy from New York, and close with the NYPD. He that was tailor-made for him, and the Democrats just really missed the boat on that. They seem to come out because they're basically their progressive wing, which they need to come out and vote. The young progressives are all for defunding the police. So you saw Kamala Harris particularly come out and support that. Joe Biden did support that, even though he's wheeled it back ever since and now denies he ever said it. But what he said was, diverting money away from police forces into, other like social workers and so on. I mean, that's defunding the police. So they've all played footsies with that. They've pretended that the protests were peaceful when, the protests were riots. I mean, we saw small towns in Wisconsin burn down, like Kenosha. So I think in those places like Wisconsin, law and order was showing up in polls as being a big issue about a month ago. And I think when the Democrats realized with their own internal polling that this was backfiring on them big time and playing into Trump's hands, they hosed it down, and now they're pretending that they're all for the police. But no one's really fooled, and Trump has the endorsement of just about every police and sheriff's association in the country.
Interesting. One of the, I suppose, the issues that doesn't get much attention is ethnic politics in the US. Now, of course, the Democrats have given huge emphasis to the blacks and Hispanics, but there was a little curiosity in relation to Hungary, where I am. Last week, Joe Biden put out a tweet recognising Hungary on its National Day, which was the anniversary of 56, and at the same time he had nice things to say about the other countries in this region, in particular Poland. And this, of course, follows after an incredibly intemperate outburst by him a few days earlier, where he basically accused a lot of the countries in this part of the world of becoming totalitarian, sort of like Belarus. People were incredibly insulted, and people on Twitter have been pointing out that for example, the Poles, Polish Americans in some of those battleground states make up about 10% of the vote. 15% of voters apparently in a lot of those battleground states, and a number of people have said, well, the Democrats just seem, once upon a time, a bit like the Australian Labor Party, they would have gone to huge effort to cultivate all the ethnic communities, but apparently they just don't bother anymore. But anyway, I don't know if that's something you've noticed, and I think there was another one the other day. The Vietnamese were saying that they felt ignored, and there was Vietnamese for Trump.
I think the Hispanic and black vote, of course, are really significant, and the Democrats need them. And I think the Latinos for Trump had a 30,000 strong car rally in Miami the other day, and in polls. And just anecdotally, especially the non-Mexican Latino vote is coming out strongly for Trump. And that's because, I guess, so many Latinos are really aspirational and very hardworking. I mean, in New York, they basically do all the work, all the hard work here. And so, he's probably going to do a lot better than people expect, so my secret pollsters tell me. And then also the black vote. I mean, that's coming up in a lot of the polling. And Trump, you could see, I mean, he's been courting the black vote for a long time, but black males particularly like Trump. And that is partly because he only got 8% of the black vote in 2016. But, there are polls showing him getting ridiculous numbers. But, realistically, he even if he just increases that by, say, 2% in the right areas, or depresses the Democrat vote, which is happening, you can already see it in the early voting in those battleground states. And I think because, before the pandemic, black unemployment rate was at historic lows. Wages were at historic highs. And so, black men are no different from, anyone else. I mean, they're also aspirational, and they were getting ahead and they liked it. So, they may not they may think Trump is a racist because that's how he's described, even though I don't think he is. But they're voting with their hip pocket. And a perfect example of that was the rapper 50 Cent, who was watching CNBC the other night, and a table came up on the screen showing what the tax rates would be under Joe Biden, and it showed New York 62%. And he just had a mind flip, and he tweeted. He took a screenshot, an image of that television screen, and he tweeted, a message full of expletives, saying F this and F that, and vote Trump, 62%. Are you kidding? I'm out of here. New York sucks, and, the Knicks never win anyway. And then he was joking and saying, later on saying, I'm 50 cents. I don't want to be 20 cents. And later it was such a backlash because he has, I think, 100 some odd million voters, or anyway, a huge number of voters. Well, no, it must be 1.5 million voters, and not voters, Twitter followers. And And so, obviously the Democrats were upset that he would be influential with young black males. So he did rescind that and say he doesn't like Trump. But other rappers since have come out. They make millions of dollars and they live in New York or California. They don't want to be paying these exorbitant taxes.
Mustn't take up too much more of your time, Miranda, but just a couple more things. We were talking about Biden before, and mental frailty, I don't think, is an exaggeration to use in connection with him. Just how did the Democrats end up with him? I mean, of all the people that were available, I mean...
Blame Obama.
Blame Obama, right. But it does seem extraordinary that where there's the additional dimension, of course, of the fact that many people will be calculating that Kamala Harris will take over at some point, with all of the issues that raises.
Very unpopular and untested, but she was among the lowest polled popular person during the primary season. She dropped out very quickly, and with I think a 14% approval level. And she's not covered herself in glory on the campaign trail. She has been acting rather peculiarly and has laughs inappropriately, and has just been she hasn't really been a negative, but she's done nothing for Joe Biden, and he really needed some youth and vitality into his very lackluster basement campaign. And also, I mean, a majority of Americans believe that he has he's senile or has some sort of cognitive decline, and it's pretty obvious. I saw him, on the ground in Iowa and New Hampshire at the beginning of the year, and he was playing to very small crowds, and even then he couldn't manage to get through a standard stump speech that any other politician could do in his speech without teleprompters. And everything he does now is teleprompters, and he's just has rests all the time. He might go out and do something, and then he'll have a week at home in the basement where you won't see him. So it's a very strange campaign, and if he did win, I don't know, it's just a miracle. I can't see it happening, really.
And finally, Miranda, back to what's going to happen next Tuesday. If Donald Trump does defy the polls, what does a Trump victory look like? Could it be anything from a narrow win with the Electoral College up to what Rowan Dean's forecasting as a Trump slide? What's your sense?
I don't think there can really be a Trump slide, a win in the popular vote. It just, mainly California is just too big. But and New York and so on. But look, I'm just going to go on my my advisors who tell me who are on the ground all the time that on the Electoral College that Trump will get over 300. And he only needs 270 to win. So it's a comfortable buffer, and that he'll win Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has 20 Electoral College votes. And, if on the night you see that he's won Pennsylvania, it's pretty much all over. Joe Biden can't win. And Trump will comfortably win Florida. So it really comes down, I guess, to, Arizona and Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin. I think he'll win with a comfortable buffer in the Electoral College, but not the popular vote, which of course just allows the Democrats to run another 4 years of saying he's an illegitimate president, and to plot their next move, which is to abolish the Electoral College and just make sure that Democrats win all the time.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely fascinating, Miranda, and thank you so much for that bold prediction to end up with, and really appreciated your time and insights. And again, congratulations on the fantastic scoops just recently. So all the best to you. I hope we see you in Budapest at some point, and well, we'd love to see you here. So many thanks again, and all the best.
Lovely to talk to you.